I did almost an entire year of it at this point online.
Okay, we're about to be live.
Okay.
Sorry, just giving us.
Well, congratulations. We'll talk more about it another.
Yes, absolutely.
I think we're live. They changed my streaming backend, so we'll see. Hello, everyone. We're hoping that we're live right now. If you can see me, like this page, let us know that you can see us. We are live tonight talking about environmental law and policy, going over the 5 major statutes and their impacts. Specifically in our region too, which is so exciting, with Jeff Fucci. And so if you are live with us, give us a like, let us know that you can see us on Facebook. And we're hoping that you're all checking in on us. It looks like we are good to go. So I am going to send the reins over to Jeff. We also have Allie with us too. If you guys have any questions on the back end, feel free to comment on the Facebook page. Allie and I will be sharing your questions with Jeff tonight. So if you have anything you need clarified, let us know and we will get those questions answered. Hopefully we learn a lot and we're all lawyers by the end of tonight. We'll see how it goes. So without further ado, here is Jeff. Welcome to Teaneck Creek Live on Facebook.
Thank you, Alexa and Allie, and good evening, everybody who's watching now and will watch hopefully later, and maybe go through a few times and take notes. There are, as Alexa said, we're going to go over 5 laws tonight that are major federal laws that affect everything, essentially, and definitely affect everything in our Meadowlands area ecology, because there's no way around it when you're out there and you're in the waterways or in a marsh or at a park, anywhere, Teaneck Creek Conservancy Park or any of the parks in the Meadowlands, that you don't encounter something that's affected by one of the laws we're going to talk about tonight. These laws themselves, they stretch back to around the 1960s. There was very little environmental regulation that came before then. And then in the 1960s and the 1970s, it really heated up. There's some anecdotal sort of stories that go along with some of these laws that people consider to be watershed events. Our Meadowlands area has its own, and some of the laws in a more national sense have their own biographies that kind of got them to where they are today. And there's other laws and other policies besides what we'll talk about tonight. So I encourage your questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about myself and my background, except to say I do have a lot of experience working in the Meadowlands District. I worked for the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority for some years, and afterwards I attended law school, a law school known for its environmental training, which is Vermont Law School, and I picked up a master's in policy and environmental science, as well as my JD. So I know a little bit about this, I hope. Hopefully I'm not faking it. It's something that I'm pretty comfortable with, and I would encourage questions. There's really nothing that's off limits, including outside of what I speak about. So there's 5 laws we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about the National Environmental Policy Act. We're going to talk about the Endangered Species Act, which is a cute one that sort of attaches itself to animals that everybody can get behind. We'll talk about the Clean Water Act, talk about the Clean Air Act, and we'll talk about CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Liability, I have to always check it, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Nobody gets that one right. It's a lot of letters, but we'll talk about them. We'll refer to them here and there by their short names. And I'll try to give about 10 minutes for each one to leave room for some questions and to leave room for anything else that comes up. Along the way, when we talk about these laws, we're going to look at some examples of things in the Meadowlands area that are local that can be related to these laws, places where these laws, as I said, sort of touched and had an impact. And I think it's helpful to see something you could recognize. And I've always thought it was important to have a different perspective on the Meadowlands than you might get driving up the turnpike, which is most people's experience, or maybe looking at it out your window. The Meadowlands, various groups, advocacy groups, and the government of this area, they do boat tours usually in the summer. The pandemic has slowed them down a little, but that's one way to see nature up close and another way to experience these types of things. So the first law we'll talk about tonight is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. That law was one of the first major well-known environmental laws. It's one of the first laws they teach in law school for environmental lawyers. It's not particularly exciting, but it's interesting for people who like to be watchdogs for their government. What NEPA did when it was created, and most of these laws, as I said, were created around the 60s or 70s, around the time of the sort of awakening of America's consciousness on a lot of issues, and definitely post-industrial revolution, where a lot of the environmental impacts had run rampant. NEPA was a federal law that was created to sort of create a paper trail process to go through, where every time a major action was taken anywhere that the federal government was able to sort of assert its role in, there was a documentary requirement that was made. So the National Environmental Policy Act creates a situation where if you're going to do something, you have to create a report. And your report has to consider all the alternatives to doing the very large scale project that you're thinking of doing. It has to consider all the impacts. And it has to consider all the effects it would have, impacts on the local area. Now, these are environmental, social, psychological on the people who live in a certain place, long-term, short-term, and there's a lot of science here, a lot of science-backed policy. NEPA has been responsible for requiring the publishing of public reports in any kind of project that either receives, there's a couple triggers for this law, anything that receives federal funding, anything that is itself a federal project run by the government, the federal government in some way, or anything that requires federal regulation. Which brings us to the Mario Cuomo Bridge, named by New York's current governor. This was an example of a project that triggered federal regulation. It's run by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It was built, I'm sorry, it's run by the Tappan Zee Bridge Authority, but notwithstanding that mistake, it does connect New York and New Jersey, so it's an interstate bridge. It runs over the Hudson River, which is an interstate waterway, and both of those trigger federal regulation. Because of NEPA, a law that requires the publishing of environmental reports when a large project like this takes place, the people who are responsible for building the bridge, the Tappan Zee Bridge Authority, they had to put out reports at various stages of the project that the public had an opportunity to participate and comment on. So they did first an environmental impact, they did a environmental assessment, which comes first. That's the first step, environmental assessment. That's where they look at the project and they see, is there any impact at all? Occasionally there's projects that don't have an impact of any kind on the environment, rare, but it sometimes happens. And there's certain categorical exclusions, another scientific legal term. Categorical, and those will come up a lot tonight. So hopefully you'll ask questions or maybe take a few notes. They used to say in school, if you repeat it 2 or 3 times, it must be important. So if I say it 2 or 3 times, categorical exception, it should appear as important to you. Categorical exceptions are things that happen all the time across the country, and their impacts can be pretty well determined. So categorical exceptions apply to such circumstances as if you're building power lines across a long stretch of land in America, the power lines are going to pretty much involve the same infrastructure, and they're going to impact the area around them in the same way. They're going to give off the same electromagnetic radiation. They're going to be the same height in terms of birds. So sometimes there's categorical exceptions to report making. That's an example of how that might occur. So this generated its first statement. Obviously, there was going to be, the environmental assessment showed there was going to be an impact. In fact, one of the major impacts of the deconstruction of the old Tappan Zee Bridge and the replacement with the Mario Cuomo Bridge, a large impact was actually on the fish populations. It turns out that at the bottom of the Hudson River, there were a lot of bottom-dwelling fish. And when they put the columns in for the bridge, and you can see those columns there, those large white columns, when they laid those footings, they had to use very large pile driving type machines that created a sonic boom under the water. That dispersed the fish populations during various breeding seasons, and that actually halted the project at various points while they did their studies on that. It triggered another law we'll talk about in a moment, the Endangered Species Act, which has to do with how you respond to a situation like that by dealing with the population that might be endangered and then offsetting it by moving the population or stopping the project for as long as you have to. And it hasn't been uncommon in the last 40 or 50 years where projects have actually halted completely. A lot of people in this area will complain about how long it took to build this bridge. One of the reasons it took a long time was they did run into some environmental issues along the way because of the impact that the development of the bridge was having on the species in the Hudson River. Now, another one that everybody in the Meadowlands will recognize is the wonderful new Meadowlands Stadium. This stadium here is MetLife. Sometimes people know it. This is the more recently built of the stadiums. And if you're interested in the history of this project, that's something you can get by going online and looking at the steps that came after. First, you had your environmental assessment. Then came the preliminary environmental impact statement. Then came the environmental impact statement. Then came the final environmental impact statement. And all these are stages in the reporting process under NEPA. And every time one of those reports came out, the public, the stakeholders of the area were invited to come and to comment and to give their concerns and to discuss different possibilities for the project, including not doing the project at all. In the particular case of New Meadowlands Stadium or MetLife Arena, that triggered the federal NEPA statute not only because of its interstate presence, but also because partially they filled some wetlands in order to build that stadium. The site for that stadium was chosen on the site of the current Meadowlands Sports Complex, which is itself almost entirely a filled wetland in East Rutherford. So rather than build a project that was once contemplated for the region, the Mills Mall, which is now long since passed, they decided they'd site all the redevelopment on what had already been largely filled. And under the Clean Water Act, when you fill in wetlands, you trigger federal regulation. So the federal government was able to require the NEPA process for this project as well. So if you're interested in the relatively recent history of how the stadium was built and what things were contemplated, for example, one of the things that was contemplated that a lot of people get excited about was the idea of putting a dome on the roof. That was something that people were interested in before the Super Bowl, because we hosted here in the Meadowlands a little, I guess, anecdote. We hosted the first cold weather Super Bowl that really ever occurred in the modern history of football. And when they were building the stadium, they wanted to put a dome on it, which would have made that game a lot less freezing for a lot of the fans because there was snow that weekend. That was going to have solar panels on it, which would have offset some of the carbon footprint of the stadium. All those things were brought up at different points, but none of them unfortunately moved forward. So everybody had a cold Super Bowl, and that was how it went. So that's NEPA. A lot of paperwork, very important to the federal government, and it's been vetted by the Supreme Court, which is what happens with these laws. They get challenged. It's been determined that environmental reporting is critical. The public's involvement is critical. As I said, projects have been stopped. Projects have been changed. This is definitely the beginning of science-backed policymaking, which is important to those of us that are environmental lawyers and those of us that are environmental advocates. And that's the first law that we go to tonight. Now, the next one, this is about the cute, cuddly animals, the Endangered Species Act. The anecdotal story of the Endangered Species Act that people like to tell is a story of a very, very small fish called the snail darter. And this very small fish would swim upstream. They live down in the south, I guess the South of America. The snail darter would swim upstream to spawn, and every year it would, go upstream as it would have to do, and it would encounter more and more human impacts as time went on. And one of these was the building of a very large dam called the Tellico Dam, to be built by the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority down in that region of the world is a power company that takes hydroelectric power at different points along the rivers down there and converts into energy for the population centers. So around this time, there was a little fish who doesn't really strike much of an impression, kind of like a small bait fish. You probably wouldn't even pay attention if you saw a fish like this in the water. But upstream, he was swimming and he was getting caught in the dam and getting chopped up and churned up, and his life was over and he wasn't able to spawn. And the Endangered Species Act was born out of that story and out of that legislation and litigation that followed over this idea of what you should do when you encounter a threatened or endangered species when you're building a project. Similar to NEPA, a lot of what the Endangered Species Act does is stop human impacts upon the environment. Sometimes those impacts are small. There's a case called, just look at my exact notes here, loggerhead turtle versus the county of Volusia County, Florida. That's a famous environmental Endangered Species Act case. That case deals with the concept of loggerhead turtles in Florida walking across a road to go to the light source because they were attracted to light as part of their biology and part of their search for breeding. They would be attracted to light. What they ended up being attracted to was Jeeps and other sorts of off-road vehicles that were parked across the dune. So they would get hit when they crossed the road. And that was a situation where the Endangered Species Act early on was triggered, and they actually changed the road setup in Volusia County, Florida, to stop the turtles from walking across the street and getting smashed by the cars. In the case of the dam, they halted a very expensive dam project that they were building, the Tennessee Valley Authority, to find a way to offset the harm that was being caused to the fish. These kinds of things have come up over time with the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act concerns itself with human impacts that cause any kind of harm or harassment. Those are the key words in the Code of Federal Regulations: harm or harassment to any species who are affected by the human project. So harm and harassment are expansive. The definition list includes bother, annoy, impact, interfere with breeding, feeding, watering if they're birds and they're cleaning themselves, any habitat building, any of those things that involve an animal's life cycle, or any species. It also applies to plant species. Anything that involves an organism's life cycle where human impacts could affect that life cycle negatively, provided that the species is listed as either endangered or threatened. And that's a good time to take a break, or not a break, but a good time to take a chance and talk about for a second something that's kind of an important overarching concept, which is this idea of something called cooperative federalism. A lot of these laws that were created by the Congress in the 1960s and 1970s, they're enforced by the states through a system where the states are really the troops on the ground who help the federal government make these laws work. So with something like the Endangered Species Act, what you have going on is not just a federal listing of species, but also a state listing of species. And the states and the federal government work together through the parks departments of those various entities to make sure that these animals are not harmed in these situations. And what that looks like in practical terms could be a project gets halted and a habitat gets rebuilt or restored somewhere else. Species have gotten moved. Human activities have been diverted. As I said, they've been stalled. The Endangered Species Act, like NEPA, has a reporting element. If you are going to impact a species, section, let's see what it is now, one of the sections here. Section 10 requires you to do a habitat restoration plan. So if you're going to impact a habitat, ESA Section 10 requires you to submit to the government a plan of what you're going to do with those species that you're impacting. There's also certain instances where some members of a species that might be killed by human impact are actually allowed to be killed if it's determined that the amount of them that will be harmed will not be so many that the species will completely be destroyed. This happens often in the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of Native American peoples of that, or First Nations of that area, rely upon certain kinds of species that are endangered as food sources. In those situations, you might get something called an incidental take permit, which is specific language to the Endangered Species Act. A taking in that statute has to do with when you actually kill a member of an endangered or threatened species. And when you apply for one, you may get a permit from the government to be allowed to take a member of the species as part of your activities. These are not usually activities that are granted to hunters unless there's a subsistence or a cultural reason why the hunt is necessary. More often, you'll see incidental take permits granted to entities like developers who are running through a habitat to build something important or that has been determined by society to be important. I suppose that's up for debate, but whatever the case might be, important enough to allow certain members of a species to be taken, which could mean killed or even impacted. And the government will issue those permits. They'll limit the number of members of the species that can be taken, or else there'll be fines attached to it. And they will usually require some sort of offsetting, which is where the Habitat Restoration Plan comes into play. And that's the Endangered Species Act. Here's an example in the photos. These are photos of the Meadowlands. These are all homegrown photos here taken by your environmental lawyer lecturer. What you see here is you see two places where the impacts are unmistakable through the Meadowlands. And the Meadowlands has been home to many species who either are on or were on and came off. In recent years, there's been a great deal of recovery in the New Jersey Meadowlands. This area right outside of Manhattan, if you're not familiar, only a few miles away, which is a brackish water estuary. Particularly in regard to birds, there have been a lot of species here who began on the endangered and threatened species list and have actually succeeded in coming off. One of those is the peregrine falcon, who was removed from the list in the 90s. That's a bird we love in the Meadowlands. That's a very fast bird. When swooping, it's the fastest animal on Earth. He's a predator. Watching him go after his prey can be a little morbid, but he's still beloved because he's a beautiful bird, majestic bird, and he lives under the Route 3 bridges. So when you drive to the city, you can think that there's a bird under there swooping around, getting his dinner. And then there's also this other bird called the tree swallow. And this is an opportunity to sort of see how habitat restoration can really be effective. The tree swallow was a bird who human impacts. The tree swallow is a small bird. It eats bugs, annoying bugs, particularly these things we have in the meadows called midges, which are sort of stingerless mosquitoes. But just because they don't have a sting doesn't mean they don't drive people crazy, because they land on them, they go in swarms. And the tree swallow is one of the birds that eats the midges. Well, the tree swallow at the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s, was actually was on threatened. Well, this was before the list, so would have been on threatened and endangered list because the tree swallow's habitat in the Meadowlands was essentially destroyed. It lived in the hollowed out holes of dead trees, and before the Meadowlands became the saltwater marsh that it is today, it was a freshwater bog, or a swamp, as many people call it, kind of jokingly, and it had all large freshwater type trees, and the birds would live in those trees. And when the saltwater came in and the ecology changed through human impacts, the tree swallows had no homes anymore. So they would continue to come to this area looking for the homes that they'd once had. And who got them? But was Mr. Peregrine Falcon, the predator, up high on the power lines and everything else, just looking to swoop down and get lunch on the tree swallows. So the tree swallows were for some time threatened and endangered in the Meadowlands. A group called the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority, today once called the Meadowlands Commission in the past, worked with various volunteer groups to go about building habitats for the tree swallows so that when they came here as part of their migration every year, they would have a place to go. And these boxes that are seen in the pictures are all boxes that were built by various volunteer groups. And then the professionals that you see, two people still work at the Meadowlands today, they go out every spring and they put those boxes in for the birds. So where the birds lost their habitat through human impacts, which although they weren't in recent times listed on a list, what essentially you would have had was a threatened or endangered species experiencing a taking, a harm, they had a habitat restoration that went on through the efforts of the government. So I use them as an example because the actual endangered and threatened species that remain on lists today in New Jersey are not very pretty. They're mostly bats and insects and things that probably aren't fun to look at, but also this is a way to see how dynamic the human impacts followed by the human corrections can be. Today, the tree swallow thrives in the Meadowlands, comes here every spring, returns briefly in the fall, does all of the things that a bird does in its normal life cycle, mates here, and has a brood every year, flies all the way to Lower Canada, which is part of its migratory pattern, goes all the way back down to South America, which is the other side of its migratory pattern. And this was all done within 100 years. So that's very good. And the kind of thing that you usually see, where you see the Endangered Species Act coming into play. I also want to just mention that these acts, these laws, this is kind of something that us lawyers kind of take for granted. How do laws get passed and how does this all work? But the way this all comes together is basically Congress passes these laws at whatever time in history it's felt appropriate. Most of these were during the 60s and 70s. Then they go through many amendments. And as we get into the next two, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, these laws have been changed many times to conform with different political regimes who influence Congress. Maybe they're more regulatory, less regulatory, and then they're enforced usually through the executive branch, and then they're often challenged at the Supreme Court level. So in addition to our cooperative federalism, which is our states and our federal government working together or sometimes against each other, you also have the same political interplay laterally at the federal level. So all of the various branches of government have some role in these laws. And in the Endangered Species Act case specifically, the two branches of government that deal with these laws the most are the Department of the Interior and the Department of Commerce. The interesting thing about that is that the Department of Interior deals with all the land-based animals and the Commerce Secretary deals with all the sea creatures. So they get involved whenever there's a taking or harm to an animal. Today you see a picture of the very happy tree swallows on one of their nest boxes, an award-winning photo right there. It was once featured in USA Today. True story. So there they are doing very well. And here's another thing worth looking at. This is called a duck blind. You can see these anywhere in the Hackensack Meadowlands District. The Hackensack Meadowlands District that I've been referencing a lot tonight, which is our local environment. The Teaneck Creek Conservancy's area, their domain, lies at the very top of that. And they're in a freshwater system that is water fed by different types of runoff, which we'll talk about in a moment with the Clean Water Act, but they're not a saltwater area. Most of the Hackensack Meadowlands District is tidally inundated by salt water that comes up from the North Bay that ultimately comes in through the mix of rivers that are there and also out to the ocean. So you could take a boat, if you had one with enough gas and you had some time, you could take it all the way out to the Statue of Liberty and you could go out to sea. And we have a tidal flow that comes in from the ocean that way, 4 times a day, high tides and low tides. So our ecology is very much the ecology of the Jersey Shore, the ecology of the intercoastal waterway that goes all the way down, to Florida. And that's what we have in the Meadowlands. The Meadowlands is especially carved. We do a little Meadowlands interlude. This is what we usually do on the boats, but the pandemic has sort of nullified our boats. But the Meadowlands is a 30 square mile approximate region that was carved out by an act of the legislature, the New Jersey State Legislature, in the late 1960s. And what happened was they set up something called a special planning district. That's a legal term of art for areas where people basically can't get along to plan it for themselves. There were many municipalities that were fighting about which towns would get the development versus which towns would get the preservation. There's a tax rateable issue with those that get the development. People wanted, some mayors and councils wanted development so that they could get money from taxes from things that would be developed. Other people wanted preservation because that was the particular way they went. The Meadowlands Commission was created by the state to create a board of people who would oversee the development in this 30 square mile to prevent the infighting and prevent a situation where one town got all and the next town got none. So for more than 40 years now, there's been regional planning in the Meadowlands District. This is an area that people commonly drive through on their way to their city and don't even know how complicated the politics and the regulation of that area is. There's only 3 special planning areas in the state of New Jersey. There's the Meadowlands District, there's the Pinelands, which is sort of along the Parkway, and there's the Highlands, which is in western New Jersey, which is the largest of the 3 areas. That's a very large watershed that runs along the Delaware River. And in each of these areas, boards of professionals are charged with all sorts of tasks, but the primary task that they're charged with in the Meadowlands is controlling the zoning and planning. So instead of a local zoning and planning board making decisions about what can be built versus what has to be preserved, the Meadowlands Commission, which is now the Sports and Exposition Authority, they make the decisions about what can be built and what gets denied. So as all these laws that we're talking about come into play, because this entire area is federally regulated. Another thing worth noting that's a big overarching legal topic is that the reason why Congress is able to pass all these laws regarding environmental regulation roots all the way back in the very, very early Constitution drafted by the Founding Fathers, something called the Commerce Clause, which is one of Congress's powers. The reason why the argument has been made time and time again that these laws that are passed by Congress should be upheld and should continue to exist in some form is that the Interstate Commerce Clause, which allows Congress to make laws about anything that occurs between different states, has been in existence since the birth of our country. It was necessary with the different colonies and then later on with the 50 states to have the ability as one federal body to make laws when everybody was affected. And it was determined in the 60s and 70s when these laws were first put together in something called their preamble, or they call it their legislative intent in the beginning. When they talk about the purpose of the laws, it was determined that all the pollution issues were interstate issues. It was impossible to contain pollution in the artificial boundaries of a state. It was nearly always impossible. Every river experienced pollution from the states that lay on both sides of it when that river was on a border. Smog traveled, groundwater that was contaminated seeped, and it was all a matter of interstate commerce. So every law that's been created by Congress that we're talking about today, they all come out of the Commerce Clause, and they've all been upheld under Commerce Clause jurisprudence, which is the legal way the Supreme Court has made most of these arguments. So a little side trip about the Meadowlands, a little side trip about how laws work. What we're looking at in front of us is a duck blind that's included tonight as part of our Endangered Species Act conversation, because one of the things that people want to do so that they don't take an endangered species is try to impact the environment that it lives in as much as possible. Duck blinds are little cute houses that people build near marshes where people can go and they can watch ducks. They can look at the ducks and the ducks don't really see them. So people can go there and they can observe ducks in the fall. If you like to look at ducks, you can go in October and November. They're very nice at the Fort Park in the Meadowlands or at the Teaneck Creek Conservancy site. And you can see the ducks and you can hide behind a duck blind and you won't kill any endangered species. So that's good. The next law we'll talk about is the Clean Air Act. That's the third of the laws we're discussing tonight. The Clean Air Act is a tough law for environmental lawyers. And the reason why is because environmental lawyers are not scientists and lawyers are not mathematicians. And often we run from those topics. We like to talk, but we only know a little about a lot. So the Clean Air Act is what's considered to be a technology forcing statute. So much of the Clean Air Act is hyper-technical and has to do with how businesses that are creating pollution are forced to change their practices to come up to the latest technology. And there are many different terms that come along with that. Best available technology is one. And then there's many others. You know, it depends when your particular polluter was built. It depends how long it's been in existence, polluting the way that it does. It depends where it is. There's many different elements that go into the matrix of what's required. But basically, the Clean Air Act is designed to remove. It's designed in hope. When it was first passed in the 70s, it was designed in hope to remove all pollutants from the air. We know today that that's not true. What we do know is that the Clean Air Act focuses very intently on 6 major pollutants, and those are carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, volatile organic compounds or VOCs, particulates, which are in 2 categories: the large particulates, which are the PM5s and above, and the small particulates, which are PM 2.5 and less. And that has to do with the diameter in microns, or not microns, but micrometers, the diameter in micrometers of how large the particle actually is. Now, we're fortunate in our area We don't live in a place where smokestacks are as prevalent as they were perhaps 100 years ago. But if you've ever seen those nightmare photos of of uh, of smokestacks just emanating, nonstop oxides and various other things into the air, and you could see the dark smoke, and people experienced acid rain, which we talked about when I was a kid. We were very afraid of acid rain eroding our garden gnomes and ruining the color of our houses. Maybe we were kids and we didn't care so much about those things, but one day we would care. And the reality is that when those types of pollutants were put into the air at a time when post-industrial revolution, there was just no concern for that type of thing and no knowledge about it, and no immediate concern for the consequences, it got very bad. And the Clean Air Act was designed to put technology forcing measures in place. So if you were going to be a business in America and you were going to do business, you were going to be forced over time to change your practices. And if at some point you don't change your practices, then you will be essentially knocked out of business by your competitor who will. Now, with different political bodies, there are different thoughts on how sternly those rules should be enforced. What's in front of us here is a photo of a power plant off of, I believe it's Fishkill Road, I think in Jersey City. It's by the Hackensack River there. There's one of the Meadowlands Commission boats going out on a tour. This power plant's been decommissioned for many years. There's another one that was previously a coal-fired plant in Jersey City on the other side of the river that's now switched over to a natural gas plant. Natural gas burns cleaner than coal, puts less pollutants in the air. This plant's been decommissioned for a long time. What you can see when you look at it is these very tall smokestacks. And at the top, you can see these little gangplanks. And above that, even, you can see these things called scrubbers. Well, imagine that as time went on, a power plant like this wanted to exist, and it was putting pollutants into the air. And these pollutants are the ones that, as we said, make up the 6 what they call criteria pollutants. And then I forgot to mention the last one is lead. As they put things into the air, the federal government from the 70s to now has been requiring them to build more and more tighter technology to control what's emanating out of the plant so that less of those things come out. And if they can't do it with netting and scrubbers, then they've got to go higher to get up into the, above the lower level of the atmosphere and higher up into the next level. And this is what happens until these old plants become completely antiquated. So you won't see a lot of things that look in modern American society, at least in our area, a very populated area of northern New Jersey and New York. You won't see a lot of these plants emanating out large smokestacks of dark materials anymore. You may see steam in the winter, but you won't see these large amounts of chemicals coming out. We can thank the Clear Air Act for the de-leading of gas. You'd have to be a child, I guess, in the 80s or earlier to remember when you could go to the pump and you could get leaded or unleaded gas. But leaded gas was available before the 1980s, and that was when the 1980s, when lead was added in the 70s and 80s as a criteria pollutant. Lead was actually removed from gasoline because the catalytic converters and the combustion that were going on in the cars were releasing lead into the atmosphere, and lead was being found to cause birth defects on children, generally speaking. And so the Supreme Court, followed something in this case called Natural Resources Defense Council versus Train. And Train was one of the leaders of the EPA at the time. And this is common. You'll often see in court cases a random person who's the defendant or the plaintiff. And that's because they will sue the director of the agency in their individual capacity or personal capacity. That's a little legalese and boring, but it happens a lot. You wonder who these figures are. Their names appear all the time. But a lot of advocacy groups will sue for tighter restrictions. And in this case, the Natural Resources Defense Council, a national advocacy group, was suing to get lead added so that lead would come out of cars and not be in gasoline anymore and not be able to be released in the same amounts into the atmosphere. And that was what happened. The advocacy groups won, the industries lost, and lead was significantly curtailed from what it had been previously. Another thing that the Clean Air Act is involved with is the California emissions. You hear people sometimes say that kind of loosely when they have cars, especially if they have old cars. They're always worried about meeting California emissions. The state of California was actually very progressive compared to other states, and the federal government used them as a litmus test for how cars should be refined to put out less pollutants. So we still, to this day, provide an exception for California, but most cars conform to California standards or higher in terms of the amount of criteria pollutants that they emit. The latest question when it comes to the Clean Air Act, and there's a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, which was in the early 2000s and still hasn't been entirely resolved. The big question has been, how will the Clean Air Act be applied to regulate greenhouse gases? At this point, it's pretty well established in the scientific community that greenhouse gases are causing global warming and climate change. The greenhouse effect is actually a problem at two different levels. At the troposphere, which we live in, which is the ground, that's where you get a local heat effect and a trapping of those chemicals that come out that cause the effects we feel in the summer, where it's just uncomfortable all the time. But then at the higher level, in the stratosphere, you have the secondary trapping of the solar rays, which is causing the global warming that we're more familiar with and hear about all the time. Greenhouse gases are definitely a problem. The question has been, since the Supreme Court case, Massachusetts versus EPA, what greenhouse gases should be added to the list of criteria pollutants, and then what does that mean as far as regulating industry? Many things put out greenhouse gases, as we know. Cars burning fossil fuels for homes, even paint cans. People don't really use hairspray so much anymore, but any kind of aerosol, certainly spray paint, things of that nature, they all put out greenhouse gases. And it's very important to advocacy groups and those that are, on the plaintiff side of these matters to try to get these greenhouse gases listed as criteria pollutants and to tighten the restrictions universally. Massachusetts versus EPA was an interesting case because it hasn't been resolved and it's been almost 20 years, but it's also an interesting case because in order to get attention on the effects of greenhouse gases, the advocacy groups, the environmental advocacy groups that brought the case, along with the states who brought the case, had to make an argument to the Supreme Court that greenhouse gases were causing them some sort of tangible harm. And the way that they made the argument was they made the argument that climate change was causing storms to surge in all the months of the year. And property owners with property at the shore, their homes were getting beat up by the storms. And that was how they made the argument. The Supreme Court bought it. It was a good argument. It was necessary to show harm to be able to get the attention of the Supreme Court to have them say, yes, you should consider these pollutants to be harmful because they look for any kind of harm when listing the criteria pollutants. With lead, it was harm to children's health. Health is always the highest and most important thing under the Clean Air Act to consider. But in this case, it was also damage to property. And that was the Clean Air Act. A lot less complicated than the Clean Air Act, and my favorite statute is the Clean Water Act. I think the Clean Water Act is probably the environmental statute that anybody can learn and anybody can drive around their community and look for people breaking it. And they can feel like they're an environmental ranger and they're doing great work. And the reason for this is that there's almost no place we live that doesn't essentially what they say drain to waterway. If you walk out to the street and you see your curb and you see your grate and your little fish on top of it, it usually says, be careful what you throw in here. This drains to the waterway. Well, everything eventually drains to a waterway. Every higher altitude finds its way to a creek, which finds its way to a river, which finds its way to a larger body of water like an ocean. And that's the reality of things. So the Clean Water Act, which came around again in the 70s, came around in response to some very terrifying scenes at the time, which was of rivers catching fire. So many pollutants had been dumped into the rivers from industry that there were rivers that you could set on fire. And one of them was well known as the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. That was the one that people always talk about. That was the watershed event that led to a lot of advocacy for what became the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is designed, it does two things, but what it does most strongly is it's designed to regulate the discharge of pollutants. Make sure I get every element of this. It's the discharge of pollutants into a navigable waterway from a point source by a person without a permit. That's a lot, but that's where it gets fun. That's where you drive around and you look in the middle of the night to see, well, where is there a pipe? And what the heck is that crazy colored thing coming out of it, going into my local creek? Where is the garbage coming from that's floating into the river? What towns haven't upgraded their storm drains? What we were talking about pipes, me and Alexa earlier, Teaneck Creek Conservancy. What are the pipes doing? Are they properly open? Are things blocking them up? Are things getting oil and gas and rubber from tires and all of these things? They're all an issue under the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was designed by Congress to restore our nation's waterways, to give us something besides rivers that caught fire. In the Hackensack Meadowlands, we were concerned, well, I was not alive, but those that preceded me who founded these agencies were concerned because there was a time when you could look out at the Hackensack River in its lower portion where it's salt water, and you would see garbage floating down it. It looked like sludge. You would see a mattress or a tire or a barrel. In recent years, after storms, we've occasionally picked up a piece of what they call flotsam or jetsam that's been floating around. But it used to be that there was so much of it that you'd be the minority if you were in a boat, not the garbage. Garbage was floating by the bagful down the river. And these things, they cause a lot of harm to the ecosystem, and they ultimately cause a lot of harm to people. So the Clean Water Act has sets limits for all point sources. And the point sources are all the things that put pollutants into a river. The point sources are the pipes. The point sources are dispersing the pollutants. The pollutants include every kind of chemical you could imagine. They also include heat. Nuclear power plants, for example, give off heat. Heat is considered to be a pollutant. If you dump heat into a water system, you can kill the fish. It causes eutrophication, which causes algal blooms, which takes the oxygen out of the water, which is essentially if you were going to step on the fish's neck, they suddenly can't breathe. They die in mass. That's why heat's considered to be a pollutant. Garbage is considered to be a pollutant. Debris is considered to be a pollutant. The reason why I show this picture is because a long time ago in Carlstadt, where I live, which is part of the Hackensack Meadowlands, there was a fondly remembered restaurant called the Barge Club. And it was a series of barges like this old one here on the side of the river that were turned into a restaurant by a local person of some, I guess he had a funny sense of humor to turn these old barges into a restaurant. And then this particular old one, he did nothing with it, just sat on the river. And time passed, and eventually the state bought the property and they intended to clean it up. But in the later years, even this barge that sat on the river was falling apart during storms. And every piece of it that fell into the river was a Clean Water Act violation. And Clean Water Act violations can lead to some very serious harm. So the questions that come up with the Clean Water Act is, what is a pollutant? At one point, a case that was decided by one of the federal courts, which one was this? It was called National Wildlife Federation, another advocacy group, versus Consumers Power Company, another group of industry people. Their concern was that fish that were being churned up in the process of a hydroelectric dam, getting caught in the dam, were being reintroduced as dead pieces of fish into the river. And was that not a pollutant or not? Was that a pollutant or not? It was considered a pollutant because it was in a form that wasn't in the river before. Heat, as I said, is a pollutant. Debris. If you happen to ever do a marsh cleanup here in the Meadowlands, you will find many, many things that appear that we pull out of the marsh, bottles and cans and children's swing sets and barrels and dolls and all kinds of strange things. All those things are harmful to the water system. And if they're coming from one place, it may be considered to be a point source. The various dams and creeks and pipes and things in the river, those could all be port sources. This is a Meadowlands picture where they're trying to unclog the Peach Island Creek tide gates in Carlstadt, where pollutants come in when people throw things out of their cars along Route 17, or when the garbage people in the town, the DPW workers, they pick up a can, but we don't put things in bags. Very terrible, because if you just throw your garbage loosely into the can, it finds its way into the drains. That's what's called point source pollution when it comes from the drains. Another issue is called non-point source pollution. That's tougher to regulate under the Clean Water Act because that actually involves the runoff that comes from all directions simultaneously. That's water that falls from the rain onto a highway and finds its way into the river at all times. That's higher elevation to lower elevation. That's things that get caught up in the flow. Non-point source regulation is theoretically included in the Clean Water Act, but it really becomes an issue for the states through their land use management to regulate that or not. And what they do is they tighten up their storm drains in the towns. They get vacuum trucks and vacuum out the garbage. They change their garbage collection practices as best as they can. And they try to encourage people to not pollute, and they try to do cleanups. And that's all there. And they also control what gets built where, land use management, bioswales, catching of rainwater, conversion of water into gray water to reuse for a lawn or a golf course, or toilets inside of a building. All of these things, these are all non-point source pollution reductions. And the Clean Air Act is ideological to talk about non-point source management, which is in Section 319, but it's difficult for them to really control how non-point source management works because it's a federal law, and all of the stuff that happens with non-point source management happens at the local level. The federal government is not large enough or robust enough to be policing what goes on in every town in that way, or whose tire blows out on the turnpike and a piece of their tire falls into the river. So that's a concern. There's two ways that the Clean Water Act determines what should be allowed to go into a water body. What happens is, again, we mentioned before, cooperative federalism. That's the states and the federal government working together. The states are far more resourced as far as people and human personnel who work for state governments to be able to go out there and really be the boots on the ground. There's two ways the Clean Water Act envisions how water bodies get treated. And we'll talk in a minute about what the water bodies, how they get determined to be under the Clean Water Act. But let's just say for now, the Hackensack River, the lower Hackensack, which we're looking at in these two pictures. The one on the right there is around Sea Caucus, where Snake Hill is, Laurel Hill, Hudson County Park. That's the big mountain there. And then on the other side, that's Mill Creek Marsh. Those two are both part of the Hackensack River. That's a federal waterway. What the Clean Water Act requires is it requires the states to submit to the federal government for approval criteria for each of their water bodies. And the criteria may be numerical, which is what are the parts per million of pollutants that this water body will be allowed to have from each of the point sources that we've determined exist on the water body. And the other is narrative. What should the purposes of this water body be? With narrative, you might see, for example, the purposes of this water body should be canoeing, like these happy people that are here. They should be able to canoe. They shouldn't have to fear becoming radioactive and growing a third eye. That shouldn't be something that they have to worry about. So therefore, canoeing, perhaps being able to immerse yourself, perhaps in some instances fishing. You can't fish in the Hackensack River. It hasn't been rated yet for that, but it is a catch and release body, not a keeping body. One day it will hopefully be a keeping body. Crabbing is not allowed in this river because the contaminants and sediments which lay at the bottom are where the strongest contaminant buildup is from the previous industrial legacy of the river. But the water body must be represented as having either the narrative or the numerical or some combination of those criteria. And every water body that's considered to be an interstate water, that's considered to be a navigable water or a Clean Water Act regulated water, every one of those water bodies has to be listed and submitted and given criteria and given to the federal government for approval. And when the federal government approves the plans that are listed by the states, they have something called total maximum daily loads. That's in section 303. That's how many pollutants can come into the river every day. Because like all of these statutes, the federal government recognizes that there's no overnight solution. And they can't say tomorrow, even though ideologically in the preamble of the law, it says they hope the waters can be wholly clean. They'll never be wholly clean in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day. There's an industrial legacy. And there's also business interests involved. The people can't be forced, or the government won't make them necessarily close their factories tomorrow that have been operating a certain way. So it comes with time. They control the total maximum daily loads. That's how much pollutants can come out from each point source. They can tighten those with time as they reassess the waters, allowing less and less pollution. This is where you see a lot of places, especially along the Hackensack. What was once a factory is now a series of townhomes. What was once Hess Oil up in Pagoda is now they're building places for people to live. Pipes that formerly leached things out are being closed and capped. This is what goes on as the Clean Water Act becomes more stringent, because with those narrative and numerical criteria, you do have a technology forcing aspect similar to the Clean Air Act.
Hey, really quick, Jeff, I do have a question that just came in from the audience relating to this. We just had a question asked, could the Clean Water Act be used to sue New York City or other municipalities to force them to ban items that would ultimately end up in waterways, such as plastic bottles or bags?
That's a good question. The Clean Water Act does concern itself primarily with point sources. And as there's actually a case from New Jersey where somebody did something very strange. They were up in, I think, Edgewater. And what they did was they worked in a lab, one of the labs, and they were trying to get rid of vials of blood. I promise I'm going to answer the question. They were trying to get rid of vials of blood. So they put them on the side of the Hackensack River and waited for the tide to take them away. And it was, it's a very strange case, Plaza Labs. Well, they determined that wasn't exactly a point source. A person putting something somewhere and walking away wasn't a point source. They've determined over time that a person throwing a bottle out of their car window is not a point source. A person, just kind of polluting is not a point source. So could you use the Clean Water Act to change human behavior at the consumer level to prevent them from gathering items that make their way into the river? Maybe not that way. What you can do is you can look to the kind of local laws, and you wouldn't be able to make a lawsuit. What you could do is you could make a lawsuit against the state of New York for not making their water bodies have a good enough criteria, whether it be narrative or numerical, to prevent the pollution that's coming in from the point sources. That's how you would sue a municipality, or you would sue a state government. And that's actually happened. That happened in the state of Vermont some years ago, where the Vermont Law School was involved. They were backing one of the environmental agencies, and they actually sued the state for not placing strict enough numerical criteria on the water bodies, particularly Lake Champlain, to prevent the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen from coming in, causing an algal bloom, choking up the waterway. And they thought that meant that the federal government should actually step in and take over. And that's what could happen if you don't set good enough criteria and enforce the criteria for your water bodies. So could you stop human behavior in terms of purchasing items? Probably not with the Clean Water Act. That's probably more of a a legislative issue. You would want to try to put some influence on your local city council people, for instance, to eliminate plastic bags. That way they don't find their way to the water body. That you would do at the local legislative level. But if your water body was very polluted and you were not satisfied with it and it seemed unreasonably polluted for the times, you could go into a process where you work with the local environmental advocacy group to petition the government to set higher criteria and to enforce them. And then you control the point sources. So I hope that answers a little. Certainly another thing you can do if you are interested in clean water to get at some of these non-point source pollutions, these floatables as we call them, that gather in the aggregate and kind of ruin our enjoyment of the waterways, you can find a local group like Hudson River Keeper or the Bay Keeper, and you can join a cleanup. We have them, Teaneck Creek Conservancy is involved with them, the Meadowlands, the River Keeper. We all do cleanups, and you go out there and you pick up bags and bags of things that find their way to the river. So much so that you wouldn't even be able to imagine half the time where they come from. It's not somebody throwing them all off a boat. They're not coming from one place. They just gather with time. So that's a great way, to fight that. And the other big question that comes up a lot with the Clean Water Act is, which waters are regulated? They have to be waters of the United States. So generally speaking, that tends to be salt waters, but it also is waters that can flow interstate and be fresh waters. Like for instance, the Mississippi River is fresh water. The Great Lakes are fresh water. Those are considered to be waters of the United States. The test for that is whether the waters were once navigable and used for commerce, taking us back to the Interstate Commerce Clause and Congress's power over these interstate bodies. The Hackensack River was used to develop this entire area, to build bridges, to build homes, to move people and goods from place to place. And it also happens to be saltwater, which makes it an easy test. And you can get a boat up it today, which makes it an easy test until you get to about Hackensack itself, where it reaches an elevation and it narrows. But it's considered to be a federally regulated water. So that's how you make that test navigable in fact and navigable in history. And thank you for the question. Whoever asked that question, thank you. It's nice to have questions. Our final law for tonight, we'll leave a little time at the end. This is the tongue twister that nobody can ever get completely right even when they go to environmental law school for several years. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. This law is not as kind of on the ground as the Clean Air Act, where you can picture factories being changed in their practices, or the Clean Water Act, where you can feature pipes being changed in their outflow. This law is more about how lawsuits work. CERCLA is a law about creating ways to shift liability so that when somebody ends up with a contaminated site, everybody who's ever been responsible for that site can be gotten at and brought in. If it wasn't for this law, various states' statutes of limitation would probably prevent you from being able to reach back to a certain point in history and be able to go after people who polluted. And they call those potentially responsible parties, or PRPs. Those are any of the entities or persons that could ever be responsible for contaminating a site. Now, I didn't want to shock and horrify you tonight by showing you the sites on this slideshow that are CERCLA sites, or that are Superfund sites, which is also what this law is sometimes called, the Superfund law. Those are the sites that are so horrifically contaminated that despite efforts to find potentially responsible parties, not enough potentially responsible parties, not all of the potentially responsible parties in the world can be found for the money to clean up the sites. And in that case, when they pose such a danger, the federal government steps in and takes them over. Unfortunately, in our area of the world, in the New York City metropolitan area, and in the Hackensack Meadowlands, there are many Superfund sites. It is very scary. There are many contaminated sites. I won't name names because it sounds like I'm after someone. I'll just say that you can drive around and look for federal signs where things have been said to have been taken over. A famous Superfund site where CERCLA was applied, actually around the time CERCLA was first made, the one that really kind of was their watershed event in the CERCLA creation by Congress was something called the Love Canal. And I only have pretty pictures of Niagara Falls, so I'll just tell this story. But the Love Canal was a product of its time in the Industrial Revolution. Somebody had a bright idea that rather than use the locks, which are a series of raising and falling waterways along the Niagara River that connect the Great Lakes of Erie and Ontario, which are different in elevation by about 250 feet, which is why Niagara Falls is such a drastic wonder of the world drop. It's difficult to get boats up that river, and they would raise and lower the waters artificially to get the boats from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. Well, somebody had a bright idea in the time of the industrial before the time of the Industrial Revolution, where the basic mentality in here in Europe was conquer everything and destroy it all and make it bend to your will. Somebody had an idea that it might be a good idea to cut a channel across the city of Niagara Falls, New York, to run from the river, the Niagara River, and connect Lake Ontario and Lake Erie without the use of the locks. It was an ill-conceived idea. They dug a massive ditch through Niagara Falls, the city. They got about a third of the way, and then the funding for the project disappeared when rail traffic increased and truck traffic increased. There was no longer a need to ship things quite that way. There were plenty of roads that were adequate and trains that were adequate to do the same job. So the creek, the Love Canal, as it was, I believe was designed by a man called Love. It doesn't have to do with romantic love. There's nothing lovable about it. They were halfway across or a third across, and they stopped and halted. And then they had a giant gaping hole in the middle of Niagara Falls, New York. So they had to figure out something to do with it. So they came up with another very good idea. As much as disrupting an entire area to dig a hole was a good idea, they filled it with toxic waste because it was a big hole. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Fill it with toxic waste. So they filled it with toxic waste, and then they thought, that's good. Now we filled it up. Now we have land again. What should we do with it? They covered it up with grass, and they put homes and schools on top of it and built a community during the post-war residential boom. And then after about 10 or 20 years, parts of that land started to sink into the ground, which was filled with toxic waste barrels that had now begun to break apart. And then the toxic waste, not satisfied to simply make the land sink, percolated to the surface. And people at the school and in the towns began to see big puddles of strange colored liquid. This was around the time that CERCLA was being considered and then was very quickly passed. And then what happened was the federal government came, took over the entire site, put a fence around it, and has been working ever since to clean it. The idea of being able to go after all of those big thinkers that I was kind of criticizing in my facetious joke there, my story, the idea of CERCLA was to be able to go after all those people, all the factories who put the toxic waste in the ground, all the designers who built the original Love Canal. They wanted to be able to hold them responsible because it is a very big check to clean up a site like that. And it takes decades upon decades to bring a contaminated site that's a Superfund. And the Superfund is the place where the money goes from all those parties to bring that back to a usable form. Now, this Love Canal was built at the turn of the 1900s, the last century. And to this day, you still can't occupy that land. The fence is still around it. People, unfortunately, are very close to it, but not on it. And the cleanup continues. And that is the story of ground contamination at that level all over our country, unfortunately. Other kinds of ground contamination, lesser ground contamination, landfill closure and remediation, gray fields, brown fields, those things are managed generally at the state level. And that's a state land use and planning kind of issue. Most states have their own ground contamination laws where they deal with those things, such as landfill closures, such as what we have in the Meadowlands, where there's pipes that collect gray water when it rains through the landfill to prevent it from running off into the water table, pipes that collect methane because that's a harmful greenhouse gas, transfer both of those things to other places where they're treated and or used. And then hopefully in about 30 or 40 years, the landfill areas can be closed. In New Jersey and the Meadowlands, we have probably around 100 landfills. Many of them are now in the closure stages of all different sizes because as the population grew, it just wasn't fashionable or possible to have landfills right in the middle of the population so much anymore. Of course, we can all cut down on our amount of garbage and use recyclable materials, use things that we can decompose or compost, and that will cut down on the amount of ground contamination as well. So that's pretty much my overview. There are other things we can discuss about environmental law. There's policy-based decision-making that happens more at the local level, but those are that's a picture of John Travolta to end with. John Travolta, just in one line, I'll quickly about CERCLA. If you want to understand and you want to see the movie version of understanding how contamination works, Woburn, Massachusetts was a site of many factories, and John Travolta is a very successful, rich civil litigator who gets caught up in the story of these people who are experiencing all sorts of cancers and diseases from the contamination that goes on from what's essentially a Superfund site. And he tries to go after all the potentially responsible parties, and he has a very hard time being up against that industry and losing a lot of support as he goes. But he fights for the people. He essentially is leading his own CERCLA type battle, and the movie actually ends. Well, I guess I won't ruin the ending, but the movie at different points, the government gets involved to help them. And that's kind of, as far as I'll say, I think you should watch it. It is a great story about CERCLA. Maybe it tells the story better than me, not sure. But Woburn, Massachusetts is a real place. And I can say to you that the story of the civil action and the contamination is so extreme that when I stopped at a Dunkin' Donuts in Woburn on the way to law school one time, I asked this silly question of the person at Dunkin' Donuts. I said, is it true that Woburn's like the movie? They probably get this all the time. And he said, yes, I'm on the fire department and they actually train us in super fun fires. And I said, oh God, that's terrifying. So it is an interesting story about Superfunds, kind of the love canal before our modern time. And those are just some of the laws. These laws continue to be challenged today. Regulations continue to be challenged, but we all have a role to play in contacting our local officials and following these matters and trying to be as least impactful on the world around us as we possibly can be. So I thank the Teaneck Creek Conservancy for letting me speak tonight. I'm always available. They'll have my information as well, but I'm always available to answer any questions anybody has or help them with any environmental issues, try to help them come into compliance and put the training and the education hopefully to some better use for our planet. So thank you to Alexa and Allie and everybody who listened tonight. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope to hear from you in the future as we share this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, so much. That was so insightful, and I think we all learned so much. We had some great comments come in just thanking us for this presentation, so we're so happy to be able to share this information with all of you and bring Jeff on to share that. There's a lot of information. We will make the information available to you if you have any other questions. If you didn't get all your notes down, we do have some notes on the back end that we're happy to share so that everyone at home can kind of read up or learn more. If you do have any questions, you can stay on for a few more minutes if you want to share those quickly in the comments. If not, I think we do have a couple questions that we can ask just to have a little bit of a discussion right now. I think initial kind of question is just kind of for you, Jeff, like what inspired you to do an environmental law or to pursue that when you were in law school as kind of a focus?
I appreciate that question. It's always nice to be able to tell your story a little bit. It honestly was growing up and working in this area. I went to college thinking I was going to be an English teacher a long time ago now. And I got involved in my second job after I came out of college, my undergraduate degree. I got involved with what was called at the time the New Jersey Meadowlands Commission. And I think Alexa, you and I shared a brief time that we both crossed paths with that group. And the people who work there are just incredible. And such a small number of people do such a large number of work across so many spectrums of the environment. And one of them was the woman who runs the legal department. And she was dealing at the time with railside waste issues where trains were kind of contaminating communities by building these places that were spilling the garbage over, and it was very unsavory. And she let me help her. I had an English degree. She let me help her as much as I could, I guess, as a paralegal, be involved in that litigation and learn about things. And I saw the work that people were doing. The Meadowlands Commission, or now the New Jersey Sports Exposition Authority, their office is literally built on a recovered landfill. And people work there that have been there for long enough to be able to tell you what it was like when it was a landfill, when they parked their cars there and garbage blew across like a tumbleweed from an old Western. And they were able to talk about that and to say, but look at what it looks like now, when they were a part of that. And I wanted to be able to have the knowledge and the tools to be able to be a meaningful part of that in our time, because those folks, they were there when it got started. A lot of them have the education, the science, the engineering, some legal background. A lot of people have all kinds of training. But our time now, our generation, the millennials, I guess, and forward, you really have to have the certification as well as the experience. And I really wanted to make sure that I went as far as I could with that so I could contribute in the way so many mentors had contributed and show me such a nice example. So really, that was it. I mean, my time at the Meadowlands Commission and the years after with the boat tours inspired me to want to go to the next level and get the education so I could know that at least I had the certification to sound like I knew what I was talking about and hopefully be more involved as somebody who played a role.
That's really great though, because it kind of shows, even without a background specifically in any of that, you can start from anywhere and kind of.
Yeah. And also, we had an interesting situation, just like it's you could be from New Jersey and you could see all these environmental issues and it might seem like if you go to a place like Vermont which I think most of us just kind of imagine, and maybe most of us get to at some point in life. Some people I think never get there. It's kind of landlocked, but Vermont's a very pristine place, and you would think that, oh, I'm from New Jersey, I've got all the environmental issues, and Vermont has none. But as soon as I got up there, I learned that they had the same issues as we have here. They're really global issues. And we were up there, we had all kinds of pollution because there was a hurricane that just wrecked a river, poured all kinds of stuff into it. There were issues with Lake Champlain with the algal blooms. I mean, the problems that we have, they're all over. They're shared by all places. So it was interesting to go up there to the pristine wilderness and still experience the same things as back home, because I've mostly only ever been here. So
yeah, it's so important too, and that ties into what you were saying earlier about the interstate commerce clause, how all of these pollution issues are interconnected. It's so important. I actually wanted
literally just to your point. I mean, literally the water that comes from the mountains up there, major issue, comes down to here. The hypoxia that goes on in the bays with the fish chokeouts and everything, all that water comes from up north and finds its way down. And for them, their issue is farms and pesticides. I mean, I could go on with the two states, but it's interesting. You're very right.
I also wanted to ask you, for someone interested in becoming an environmental lawyer, do you have any recommendations for them?
Go to law school. Now, I mean, it's definitely becoming a lawyer. Yeah, actually, I could. Becoming a lawyer is a little bit of a process. There were many nights in Starbucks with those kind of like merciless sort of practice tests you have to take. It's a little bit of a process. You have to get into law school. You have to take an LSAT for most law schools, which is the way in. There's these kind of tough games, but not to discourage anybody. You can train yourself to do it. It's a trained exercise. You set out your mind. You say, I'm going to go to law school in a year. And when I go to law school in a year, I'm going to go to a law school that has environmental classes. And then I'm going to take the LSAT, get my score, get into one of those law schools, and then make sure that after my first year, I focus on as much environmental law as possible. A person has a lot more control over what they do once they get to law school than it might seem like on the outside. Law school is often portrayed to people who haven't gone to law school as this kind of sort of factory where you go in and you're only allowed to do one thing one way. That's not true. After your first year, when you take your courses that are required by most of the bars, you can pretty much take any courses you want for the next 2 years and pretty much intern or work anywhere you want during the next 2 years too. And if you choose places that focus on environmental issues, and you choose classes that focus on environmental issues, most of what I talked about tonight was a summary of notes I had from environmental law that I took classes probably on each of these statutes, and those classes were available. So it's about setting up that year and getting yourself ready to get to law school, because you have to take the LSAT and apply and things like that. And then once you get there, saying, I'm going to take some courses that may not yield the best economic returns right away, but are going to make me feel good about being an attorney. And then you take those courses, and then you're on your way. And then you try to pick, I hope, a firm or I think more likely than not, a government agency or a nonprofit that specializes in that type of work. And then from there, you read a lot of statutes and hopefully you get to be outside a little bit.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that kind of ends our discussion. I think it's a happy note to add it on to, encourage other people if they want to be involved or become a lawyer or work on these kind of issues that, it's out there for everyone to kind of be a part of. So I wanted to say thank you again, Jeff, for joining us tonight, and just remind everyone that we are continuing this series next week as well, talking more about advocacy, which would be more of the kind of hands-on ways that people can work in this field and get change made at their local level. So we hope you'll join us next week at 7 again as well. And Jeff, anytime you want to come back, we're happy to do another program. This was great. We really appreciate you taking
Honored, Alexa and Allie. Thank you very much for letting me join you tonight.
Yeah, we hope that everyone will watch this over again. And if anyone needs notes, we'll definitely be posting those for everyone so that you can become an expert in environmental law too. All right. We hope everyone has a great night, and we will talk to you soon. Good night, everyone.
Night.